Welcome back, tubes. About halfway through the last video, these parts showed up behind me on the floor. I was multitasking and I didn't need to show you all that getting cleaned up and happening because you've seen it all before, but when we were last here, I had just successfully put together a rotating assembly without anything at all going wrong. Yeah, I couldn't believe it either. That was always supposed to be the one that I was going to freshen up and just send, but 4 years ago I pulled it out of the car and that was when I found out that it needed one of everything. It's 10 overbore, BCH beams, ceramic coated Wiseco HDs at 8.5 to 1, and calico coated ACL bearings all around, balanced to within a tenth or two of a single gram. Anyway, this is another 6-bolt, and many of you are going to recognize it. If you don't and you have questions, I promise you it's all answered here in the GSX playlist. What's not here is the wake of destruction that this block has caused along its journey behind the scenes trying to complete it. To my financial life, my social life, I'm talking everywhere, everyone, every person that's handled it. And I'm grateful for all the people that have helped, whether or not they've been successful or this wouldn't have happened. Everything inside this wrap job is assembled by the same guys that did the machining to the Gallant block, and you can tell at a glance that the level of detail far exceeds anything that you've ever watched me do. This one's got Manly Turbo Tough I-beams with Wiseco HD 8.5 to 1s, 40 over, there's oversized main bearings, and we had to throw away all prior work and start over. I'm not going to be the one to tell you anything about how to install billet mains and do that machining, but it's been fun doing all the things that we could do in my garage, and thank you DK for that sick crankshaft that's finally getting its day in the sun. This finally turns a page on a story that I set out to tell you 10 years ago. But it hasn't even been 4 years since I decided to build 3 engines instead of simply failing at one. I can't fail it without one anymore because here it is. So now we're going to go too wide on the assembly from here. There's a little bit of catch up to do on that GSX block, and even though they're both 6 bolts, as you can see they're about to be nothing alike inside and out. My goal is to build at least one of these by the end of the video, both if I can pull that off, but whichever one I'm able to complete first is going to get this nice shiny new fluid damper crankshaft pulley and ARP bolts. That'll be its reward for cooperating with me. I'm laying out both sets of 6-bolt parts here to make sure that I've got all my last-minute arrangements settled prior to putting both of them together. During the course of my inventory, I ran across everything that I forgot to treat with black oxide. I was pretty happy getting through 2 whole car subframes and most of the Gallant engine using only one single kit of that stuff, so I got another. Of course, you supply the distilled water to mix and rinse everything with, bring a degreaser and dilute it, mix the acid 9 parts water, and I selected the black oxide kit that uses the penetrating sealer. I stopped bothering pouring the sealer out of the can. It comes in plastic bottles now, but as long as you don't contaminate it with water, you can keep on using it. And because this stuff sticks to metal, plastic, or anything that you put in here, I made something disposable and perforated to contain the bolts so that I can just dip them all into the can with this can. It's pretty obvious what I did here. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You wire wheel all the zinc, rust, and dirt off, which you don't need to see happen. You know what that looks like. Then degrease the bolts, rinse them so that no soap remains, then dump them in the phosphoric acid, which is the oxidizer, and watch the magic happen. Agitation frequently helps whenever stuff starts getting stubborn. Rinse off the acid before using the sealer, and I learned that drying them prior to sealing them yields a much more pleasant result that gets less of that black oxide stuff on your hands later when you're putting it together. Even though it makes them appear a little bit lighter in color, it's a worthwhile effort in your results after that last rinse. But yeah, I found like 150 things that needed work, and I'm about 90% done with all of it at this point. If you clean up your bolts on a wire wheel and then you reinstall them without doing anything else to them, then you gave them all running shoes to rust, turn orange, and brown very quickly. That's going to make your other efforts look terrible very quickly, so it leaves you having to do something else to protect them. There are zinc plating services available, but on these I wanted them to look a little bit different than the normal ones, so it's nice to have them all done now. I was changing some things around in here, which also changed a whole bunch of the fasteners, so I had to complete my theme and get those random bolts caught up like this. Of course, for the GSX's 6-bolt block, things are going to be a whole lot different from the stock appearing Gallant engine that I'm putting together. I'm putting this Frontline Fabrication 6-bolt oil pump on the GSX with an external oil filter housing, and while this is most certainly a major change for what a 6-bolt ever came with, it's going into a 2G, which none of the 2Gs came with a 6-bolt, so all kinds of stuff is going to get weird on this one. That one looked fun, but I'm not exactly leaving the Gallant alone. This one's going to be receiving an air oil cooler in place of its original sandwich cooler. So several of my bolt lengths had to adapt, and they weren't treated yet. They are now. Aside from the random pile of bolts that turned up, there was a lot of other little stuff like that, but the bolts aren't the only things that I wanted to try this black oxide treatment on. I got a wild hair and decided I didn't like how those timing tens looked, so I bead blasted them, washed and dried them real good, and then I mixed up a larger batch of that stuff just to see what these were going to do in it. I scrubbed everything clean in a diluted simple green bath, go rinse them in the sink, and then hit the second bucket with them. I'm going to do these a couple of pieces at a time. I'm pretty sure this stuff doesn't react with stainless steel, and I'm also pretty sure this alternator bracket is stainless steel. So if it is, and it doesn't do anything, then we'll know that both of my pretty sures are completely trues as expected. And it is, nothing. This arm is stainless steel. It's going to take other stuff to do that. But the tins aren't made of tin, they're made of mild steel. Mild steel and hardened steel love this stuff. It comes out different colors based on the materials, and it has a tendency to turn zinc brown, but it doesn't remove it. These are well used. They've been stressed and fatigued. Some of them have come apart. They're actually two stamped pieces of metal glued together. Their thickness matters because it's part of the spacer that holds up your timing and idler pulleys right in the middle of everything on the timing side. Instead of using the sealer, I blow them dry, clear coat them for rust protection, and seal that patina in there. The only thickness I'm adding is one coat of clear. I doubt I'll misalign my timing belt with that. But I wanted to do something different on this one other than powder coating, and I think this black oxide on the timing tins looks really cool. Another way that you can use this stuff is full strength with a rag or sponge. You can dilute it up to 4 parts water. I just tried using a paper towel and it's terrible at this. It's too absorbent. But it pretty much instantly makes it turn. Just be sure to rinse all the acid off afterwards. And seal it with something, anything. This stuff offers no real rust protection. Zinc is better protection than this. It's mostly an aesthetic treatment. I got this stuff sorted out just in time because this thing goes on right before the timing mount. The 1G timing mount sandwiches itself in place on that stud. On a 1G it's held down by 2 bolts and a nut. Biggie shorties with washers assembled. Grade 7 and 8. There's usually an extra bolt on the 2G, and this is a 2G mount, but I modified it, cutting off one of the bolt holes. Yes, I cut a hole somehow. I did it on video too, it's here, but I also did something else really wrong to this oil pump back when I prepared it. I totally used the wrong grease. Grease will plug up your lifters until the oil gets hot enough to melt it. I thought that amount was minimal, but either way, it's bad. It has to go. I just need to use something thinner and more soluble for this in oil. So I'm undoing that thing that I did wrong in the past. Some people say to use Vaseline, and I still think that might be too thick. Prime your engines by all means, but adding lubriplate is a pre-prime because once it sucks the oil up the pickup tube and hits the gears, it's going to prime itself and do the rest naturally from there. I thought I sorted all my bolts out right when I did the inventory, but one of them had a double washer and it was the wrong grade, so I had to replace it. We'll put that one behind the cover. Clean it, blast it off with air. OEM 6-bolt front case gasket. MD 998285 front seal installer. This thing stretches the seal over the crank and aligns everything to prevent scratching it. It ensures you keep the spring in place that goes around the inner lip of the crank seal too. I never managed to find the crank seal installer anywhere. I've been looking. That's never come up in my safe searches, but mission accomplished. I'm just snugging all these bolts down for now, hand tight. I have more stuff to assemble on here, like the oil filter housing, and there's a gasket right there. If you hold the bolts in your extra hand, you can keep it all stacked in there with the gasket and slap it on there all at once. All of these bolt lengths are different, and that's taking into account the number of parts they secure and their thicknesses, as well as for the specific amount of block protrusion that you're going to have out the back side of the front case. But on average, there's between 5 and 6 threads extending past the front case on most of them. The timing tensioner and the oil filter housing are part of the bolt sandwich, but fortunately the timing tensioner shoulder bolts are really easy to identify. They got that thicker part of the shank all up on that jank. Look at that. But the oil filter housings kind of suck because each different oil filter housing requires different length bolts. I always just have to stack those up and fit them and test them and figure it out. All of the M8 bolts on the front case get between 14 to 16 foot-pounds. I mean the bolts that only go through the front case. Not the timing tensioner nor the oil filter housing. They have different specs. It looks to me like I've got a bad one here because it's hitting torque and still turning. They're supposed to stop. I hit max torque load and the bolts stopped on all but 2 of them. Now, I know I have a replacement right here for one of them and that fixed that one, but I'm going to have to look around for a grade 4 flange bolt that long. And look at that. Now it wants to cooperate. I'm still replacing it, but it's easy enough to get to that one, so let's move on. For the oil filter housing bolts, I'm using 12 pounds. Spec is 11 to 16. The one big M10 front case bolt gets between 20 to 25 foot-pounds. I went with 25. The timing mount bolts get between 22 to 30 foot-pounds. I went with 26. And the same thing goes for the 14mm nut and washer that's on the stud. Now I'm totally screwing up here because these parts have to come right back off, but for the sake of consistency, let's torque those and get the specs right here in this segment. Timing tensioner bolts get between 14 to 20 foot-pounds. I used 16. And the timing tensioner arm bolt is actually not in the service manual. It's typically a high-grade bolt, and I'm also giving that one 16 foot-pounds. Timing idler pulley gets 28 foot-pounds, using all OEM stuff here. And right here we've got the timing tensioner pulley, or the happy face pulley, whatever you want to call it. But there's the part number. That one's going to get 31 to 40 later when we're finished, but right now it's just a placeholder.
I'm an idiot. You get the water pump on there first.
And about that, right there, you see we have a prized factory 6-bolt water pump new in box, or the 1G unit anyway. There's your part number right there. It's on the box. And I filed my fasteners away in here with it, but because this Galant's a JDM Thoroughbred, I'm staying all factory stock appearing on the exterior. Wouldn't want to let any aftermarket anything appear on the outside of my... Hmm. Yeah, I knew that, and they make their timing tensioners too. You can compare your Ison timing tensioner to the factory one that I just showed. Mitsubishi does this all the time. They don't make some of their parts, but the engine bays of Nissans and Toyotas are often filled with Mitsubishi logos because they make stuff for everyone else. The only person who's ever going to know the difference is the one that opens the box. Let's slap this thing on there. They get 9 to 11 foot bounds. Good gravy, Jafro. Why are you giving them 18? That's okay for one of them, the one with the alternator brace arm bolted on it. It gets 14 to 20, but why, you brute? I suppose these bolts are good, or they were good. Crank timing gears, guides, washer, bolt, just putting them on there for now. I'll come back and torque all this later. In fact, I've removed and put the tensioner arm and the tensioner back on here so many times that I've given up on trying now. I apologize for my rust. It's been a little while. Everything stacks in here in a specific order. But let's do all this again, shall we? Right here I've got the complete Mitsubishi OEM gasket and seal set. This is the complete rebuild set for a 6-bolt. If I do everything right, then I'll have parts left over because it includes the seals and the gaskets for every available configuration of it. And some of these parts could even be completely replaced by RTV for weight reduction. But you know me, I'm going to use all the factory stuff that I can, and then I'm about to install the factory part into the least factory front case that I can get my hands on. I love the craftsmanship of this front case. There's nothing else like it. I don't have the right seal driver. Yes, that's the ball joint press that you watch me use on the Galant control arms. The back of it's the perfect size for this. You can do many different things with most of these tools, and that's handy when you haven't found the crank seal installer in all of the 15 years since you started looking for it. Someone give me that, lol. I've never tried to fit this on a 6-bolt. This is fresh out of the wrapper with a light cleaning, and of course I cleaned up the block and put a gasket on it just for this occasion. I noticed prior to installing it that many of my bolts needed to change in order for this thing to work. The seat heights of several of the bolt holes are different. But that's fine. Even though I have a collection of brand new front case bolts, I've found most of what I needed pretty easily to fill in the blanks in my spare parts. You know, some of them won't fit, so I ordered some cap screws. We'll see how that pans out when they get here. I already had a few of them in my spare parts bins, and dang it, if this thing still doesn't fit. The block I extensively sanded and painted. This is probably in someone else's instructions or social media posts that I've missed over the years, but to tell the truth that I don't care. I set out to test the coating, and this is a real world test. I have to grind away some of the sloppy casting here in the corner for this pump to fit in here, you know. It's got a clearance issue. I don't care if I'm ruining this coating so much as dying a little bit on the inside for making this huge mess right now. Really, I hate everything about what I'm doing, but this block deserves it after everything it's put everyone through. Why not compromise a small section anyway? The coating's good and baked on. We'll see if that makes any difference someday. As a follow-up for those that were upset that I didn't test fuels, many of the other chemicals tested contain the additives in fuels that can make this coating fail.
Now it fits. Fits like a glove.
Fuel soaking in this full strength will most likely cause it to fail eventually because it was all affected by different forms of alcohol. I can't get pure gasoline easily here, aside from ordering a drum of it or getting it from a boat dock, but I'm pretty sure that it'll fail in that too, full strength. The use of high ethanol content fuels was not a popular thing to do anywhere back when people first started using this coating, and that's why this is a 21st century experiment in a boosted domestic import. This will answer whether or not fuel residue from blow-by has any effect on an oiled crankcase. I'm going to break it in on gasoline, check it, switch it to E85. Of course, I'll be checking it along the way, cutting filters and trying to prevent anything catastrophic, but if a failure ever does occur, it'll be spectacular no matter what the cause, I promise you. I mentioned this front case takes different fasteners. There they are right there on the screen in more ways than one. Clean both parts and put a gasket on it, the factory one will do. Grease the seal or oil the crank snout, or both. It won't hurt anything. This is a pretty good example of why that crank seal guide is convenient for this. Yep, piece of cake alignment. Hard to have a bad outcome with it. You can use your factory bolts, just not all of them, and there's not enough of them to go around. 2 of the holes are recessed in holes that the factory bolt heads are too big to fit in, so those are off limits and are going to need something different. I didn't use 2 of the bolts that I showed, but that list is correct. I gave it a quick buff and wiped away all the evidence. Now, Kigley 6-bolt crank trigger. It came with the right length bolts, so I used those. Factory balance shaft drive gear delete spacer thing came with that too. Reluctor wheel, 1 of 2. We'll figure out which one fits. I started with the one marked middle, just to see if it'll fit, and it didn't. So I tried top, because the thing said that it probably is the one for aftermarket stuff. I read it. And this right here is what it said to do. I got myself a 6-bolt with a crank sensor now. Now look at that one. Just look at it. Right in the middle. That's what you want. That's how you know. You got to put your eyeballs onto it. In my case, top is middle. I'm talking about the markings on the reluctor wheel. It's not confusing. Just read the thing. This time around, all the front case bolts get 14 pounds. Whether it's a cap screw or a flange bolt or a crank trigger, I don't care. That's the low end of the factory spec. But the way I see it, there's no oil filter housing. I've got 2 extremely flat surfaces to work with, and even more bolts going through it than the factory one had before it. So I think that's going to work fine. I did 23 foot-pounds on the big one, M10 by 30 flange bolt. Okay, crank timing gear. Despite all my preparations, prognostications, and protestations, this timing gear will not fit this crankshaft. And then I'm all like, oh. Because that helped me figure out that I somehow managed to get these 2 swapped exactly backwards. And that's a good thing, because you want this part to be an extremely snug fit. I thought the Gallant gear felt a little bit loose when it went on. And speaking of which, loose things, that one long M8 flange bolt that yielded its spirit. I found my other replacements for that one, and I will not leave that stone unturned. It won't look like the rest, but it's behind a timing cover, and this is function over form. And look, this one actually stops at its torque load. It has threads. I'm going to get this tensioner arm greased up and continue on with the rest of the timing bits. First up, we've got the timing idler pulley. There's the part number again. Brand new hardware for this one too. Man, this is going to be a gold mine for parts after it blows up. Brand new timing tensioner and bolts here as well. New bolts are going to get 16 pounds. The tensioner arm's been powder coated, which is absolutely ridiculous. That's never a requirement, and it addresses absolutely nothing. Looks cool though. Happy face pulley, another one anyway. Starting to make sense yet how these are 2 of the same thing but different? It's really nice to be getting both of these 6 bolts out of the way. For those of you who have followed along but lost the plot, I'm building 3 engines for 2 cars. This is 2 of the 3. I want my GSX back, and one of these is bound to do the trick. Everything seems to line up fine with the 2G timing mount, 1G tensioner arm on a 1G block, so I'm going to take this tensioner arm right back off and torque these motor mount bolts to the block using 25 foot-pounds. Same for the nut too, and the idler pulley. It lands right in the range of the torque spec for all of these. I'm going to leave the tensioner arm bolt loose for now though. I'm going to goat head and prep these decks because we're about to have an engine here. Drive these bushings in first. Remember, these guys are racing for a dampener. And I'm not proud of how that install went with the second set of bushings. I'll clean that up, but you can bet that I'll try something different next time. Back to the Gallant. You'll hear compressed air. I blew the head gasket bag off too before I did that. I hope that you're not surprised to see me using the factory composite head gasket on this one. My GSX did fine at 27 psi daily for the last 20,000 miles of its life, with nothing other than a set of 11mm ARP head studs. My failure had nothing to do with the head gasket, and these 12mm ARP bolts will certainly do the trick. They're a millimeter bigger than the other ones. All of this is just fine for my goals on this build. This is the same cylinder head I put together 2 videos ago. Its history is in that video's description if you're curious, and it was at this point right here in the edits where it was the first time I saw those labels on the cam gears. They're supposed to be dowels up, and now I know it made that sound. But I cleaned up the deck with 2+2 coffee filters and compressed air before flipping it over, taking the valve cover off, and doing that so that I can lube and install all 10 of the ARP washers on both sides. You want to do this first with a 4G63 because the washers won't clear the valve springs after you set the head on the block. I look through the stud holes as I lower the head down, multiple ones, to ensure beyond any shadow of a doubt that it's all lined up before setting it down, because the studs are lubed, the deck is perfect, and I want to keep it all that way. Make sure it's all flat and straight, fully seated on there. Good. Now we're talking. Next, I grabbed my deep well 12.14 mil socket and started lubing and installing all 10 of the nuts. It wasn't long into this that I figured out that I could fit my skinny magnet through the socket to hold the nut until I got it aligned and threaded, and then I pull the magnet out to release it. We'll do that again someday. Made everything about this really easy. The ARP studs get a 3-stage torque sequence to 90 pounds. So here we go, starting with 30. Everything I said about torque wrenches in the rotating assembly video still applies here. Slow, gradual, smooth, non-stop movements, and hold the wrench at load until it stops turning. 60 pounds. Do yourself a favor and have the torque sequence right in front of you where you can see it. Every stage of this sequence needs to be repeated exactly the same way in order to properly crush the head gasket. So you want to get it right every single time you do it. So with 10 bolts, 3 stages, 30 reps, it gets tiring. That's 10 to 15 minutes of hardcore wrenching, 90 pounds. The easiest way to deal with that is what I call dead arm method. Brace your foot on the leg of the stand, straighten and stiffen your wrench arm, and lean back and use your whole body weight instead. Rather than just using the muscles in one arm, you get to control the torque load using however many muscle groups there are between the wrench and whatever you're bracing against. I hit every single one of those within 0.2 of a pound, and I'm happy to report that the combustion chamber is now sealed. It's been a long time since I've done this, and it didn't look anywhere near this good the last time I did it. Nowhere near as fresh. I also didn't expect my Gallant block to look like this at all. But we're not finished. Cam gears both get 72 foot-pounds so that I can seal up the head. I always check these twice. Nice fresh ARP cam bolts. The valve cover installation is a snug fest. You put the valve cover on, snug all the bolts all the way around, like 3 or 4 times. Finger tight until they all stop snugging finger tight, no more than a quarter of a turn at a time. I prepped this gasket for this day back when we built the head. And now this is a look on my face after the timing belt is done and I realized I don't have timing tins on the head. I die a little on the inside, because this is me sneaking the timing tins and bolts back in here behind the cam gears and tightening down through acts of acrobatics and unfortunately some calculated preparation just for such an event. I totally forgot why I left the cam gear bolts loose, and I just paid for it. Several times I'm trying to hold my mouth right. You can see that I'm briefly losing my mind, but ultimately I was very successful on both thanks to the help of this one very stupid looking toy-like 10mm wrench that's a part of the Craftsman Master set. Skinny wrench. Would not have been able to pull that off without it. It's ready for timing belt. Line up all the marks, get the thing around all the gears, preload the exhaust can to keep those marks level, and hold that belt against the gear while you check the other marks. If those are good, slip the belt over the tensioner pulley last. It makes it real easy. Preloading the exhaust gear gives you all the slack necessary to slip it past the loose tensioner pulley. Once it's on there, it's slack. Just rotate the happy face pulley up as far as you can by hand and snug the bolt. This will keep the belt snug enough not to jump time while it's being rotated, because if you don't, it's loose, and it's totally going to do that. Next, turn the crankshaft 90 degrees counterclockwise and then back to line up all of your marks. This changes the valve spring tension, reloads it onto the belt, and reveals whether or not you're a half tooth off on the cylinder head. The cam gear marks, there's 4 of them, they should all line up parallel to the valve cover flange. If you're a half tooth off, only 2 are going to line up. Check your timing gear mark, and we're good. Next, we set the timing belt tension. You need 2 torque wrenches to do this. This one's a bicycle needle style inch-pound unit. You can see that it's graduated really lightly. 60 inch-pounds is only 5 foot-pounds. So this is a very lightweight torque wrench, because while the big center bolt needs 33 foot-pounds with the big wrench to set it, this wrench sets the belt tension on the happy face pulley, and you aim for around 22.5 to 24.3 inch-pounds for that at the same time. You got to tension both at the same time. So with the pin still in the tensioner, first you rotate the pulley clockwise and hit the inch-pound rating, and then loosen, snug, and torque that center bolt. Still not done though. Next, you take the load off the tensioner using the other special tool, and then you pull the pin. You back the special tool back out, or at least loosen it no less than 5 turns. Then you rotate the crankshaft 2 full turns clockwise. When you turn the crank, the tensioner adjuster will extend because it's under pressure and you're removing the pressure off the adjuster side of the belt when you rotate it. Between the lifters and the settling of the belt tension balancing itself across the pulleys, the tensioner is going to get pressed back down again, but it takes about 15 minutes before it all settles. That means you have to wait at least that long before you can bother with getting your result. So go wait it out to see if you did it right. Yeah, I know, it's mean, but that's the way they did it. If at any point prior or after 15 minutes have passed, you're able to reinsert the pin all the way through the holes, all 3 of them, then you did it wrong. It's too tight. But that's not how you check it. That's just how you avoid wasting 15 minutes. The specification for the tensioner arm gap marked A is 3.8 to 4.5 millimeters. That's only 3/100ths of an inch between low and high spec, so there's very little wiggle room. Feeler gauges are going to be too clumsy for measuring this. Calipers won't work, especially not if the engine's in the car, and also the A measurement becomes subjective if you come at it from the wrong angle. Someone posted this trick in a forum back in the day and I liked it. I adopted it. Measure a pair of drill bits that are slightly above low and slightly below the high specs. So essentially, I'm creating an even narrower spec for myself than that 3/100ths to have to hit. And I try to insert them all the way across the machined edge of the tensioner under the tensioner arm. If the small one just barely fits and the big one doesn't at all, like you see here, then you got it. And you know you've got it when it lays flat and it's hard to turn in there. Don't try to pry it under there, then you're just guessing. It should just be a very difficult fit that still fits. You'll notice the tensioner holes protruded ever so slightly, just enough that you can get the pin almost all the way through it. It's a very narrow margin, and I actually got it right the first time, but here we are 2 hours later because I got it wrong the next 5 times trying to put it back and get it to this point again with timing tens. Just remember, as you go through life, even with the best of intentions, we're our own worst enemies. No matter what stands out to you from this video, that point applies to it. But despite all of it, that still went incredibly smooth. I can't say that we've got an engine yet because I still need to dial the cams in and bolt some other parts onto it, but there are some fairly innocuous parts that I've been tripping all over down here that I'd like to get up off the floor. I painted these originally, but second-guessed my efforts and handed them right off to detective coating afterwards. All except the ones with rubber parts because they were in excellent shape. You can see all the bolts are stabbed into their homes waiting, and it doesn't matter if they go on now or later. I'm just clearing up my floor and my shelf space by doing this. Plus, it let me install my dipstick tube, one step closer to a sealed crankcase. That thing's held on by one of these bracket mounting bolts. I gave it 45 foot-pounds all around. I gave both of these brackets 45 foot-pounds. Engine supports 36 to 51 foot-pounds actually, and the roll stop bracket is 40 to 54. So that's well in range for both. Yeah, this looks way better than my paint job and is going to be so much easier to keep clean. The power steering bracket's just becoming a placeholder for me right now. I'm not torquing this one on yet. I still got plenty of other work to do. Dipstick, this hole is officially sealed. For the rear roll stop, I'm not going to torque this one yet. If you're at this stage and you forgot, this one has the bushing flange facing downward on it. So when you bolt it on the block, it's actually angled up, unlike the front one. This AC bracket scene got clipped because I derailed myself trying to figure out what I did to myself. I'd really sabotaged me. Had my timing mount bolts and the AC bracket bolts in the wrong places and looked everywhere else for them first. Moving right along, the GSX has got some catching up to do with the Gallant. Oh, the toolbox space, how I have missed thee. Y'all are going to recognize this one. Another blast from the past just like that Gliptol block. Yeah, it's the cylinder head that goes with it, that's pretty obvious. It's the original 7-bolt head. This is not the one that I just polished. This one is the reason why I had to polish another one to look just like it. And those videos were a documentary of the process of how I did this, because I did this originally back in 2004. I was unable to punish you with that series back then because that's 2 years before the standard definition version of YouTube was even invented. This one saw all of the history and abuse of the King of Bling era. It's been rebuilt twice and ported by our good friends at Ballast Machine. I had so much success with this build back in the day that I wouldn't even be on YouTube today at all without their help. I don't think they expected me to turn into the kind of customer that I did, but with my goals and expectations, I was really asking too much of them, really. Yeah, I'll be honest. This one's ready to go with SuperTech stainless intake valves, Inconel exhaust valves, Viton seals, Kigley beehives at 98 pounds of seat pressure, but worst of all, the valve install height needed to be corrected to accommodate these Kelford 280 cams that I've got for it, and their 11.8 millimeters of lift. Cutting the seats larger for a bigger valve is only one of the ways that you can raise a valve seat after it's been cut a few too many times. It's not ideal for airflow. Replacing the seats is really expensive, but it doesn't help at all to install a bigger valve into a 4G63. In fact, it's going to negatively affect its part throttle drivability, so it's a budget route. In my case, and for this car, I'm okay with all of that. So now that we're all reacquainted after all these years, I did my last minute preparation with everything that I did on the Galant. Everywhere you saw me use sandpaper is going to be 600 grit, and I took it one step further with white rouge and polished up the cam journals on this one. This will promote a healthier oil film layer, so it's why I did this. White Diamond Rouge doesn't contain any abrasives. It'll wash away with soap and water, really. I'm not removing any material. I'm only stretching the molecules on the surface. The shine is just their natural defense mechanism. I know it's messy and I'm not proud. There's just things I could have done better and I'm doing them right now at the wrong time. Now, there are sharp edges everywhere on this one from the resurfacing. There are some things people take time to do, and there are some things that people don't get paid to do. So I'm cleaning up all of this with sandpaper that I was talking about. Same roll I used on the caps, just tore some of the fresh paper off, and all I'm doing is carefully rounding off every single sharp edge that I can find. Watching out for the valves and the deck surface. I really should have this deck taped up and trimmed out right now for this. And I am an idiot for not doing that. I'm just pointing that out. Do with it what you want. But next, I gave everything a thorough, comprehensive cleaning, installing 10 12mm ARP head studs. We'll see how far that gets us. Installed dry, finger tight in the bottom of the bores, and then next I use a bolt with the same thread pitch to spread ARP lube inside all of the threads on the studs. And here we go. This is how we do this, right? Brand new factory MLS head gasket, fresh out of the original bag, and dust it off with air just in case. Drop that on there. Put all these lubed ARP washers in place first to reduce the struggle. Supposedly. You just watch me do this on the Galant block, and it's important that you see me following all my same advice here for this one too. But no matter how correctly I go through all these steps, it's not going to fix the other glaring problem that I've got going on here. I mentioned the Galant block got punched 40 thousandths. Yeah, an MLS gasket is absolutely not going to cut it on a block that's been punched out 40 thousandths. You might get away with 20 thousandths, and this kind of gasket can be cut by a machine shop to fit for such a task, but you know, I didn't do that. So the multi-layer gasket is denser than the block or the head, and therefore it's going to retain heat longer than everything else that it's sealing up. Longer than the block will. Having a hot steel gasket surrounding the quench area is a recipe for pre-ignition if it's right up to the bore or protruding into it. You definitely don't ever want the gasket or the fire ring protruding into the bore. So as far as I'm concerned on this one, this time around, this MLS gasket's not going to cut it, and I'm going to have to order a different solution for this one. This seriously sets this block back in the race for that crank pulley. Not looking good for that one, but I'm going to go ahead and bag this head gasket back up, put it back with all its other friends. You know that I'm going to bag this blingy Gliptol head up again too, just because of this unfortunate discovery. This is going to have to wait a minute. So I can use my workbench for something else. You know what I'm going to do with it? I'm going to dial in the Galant block's camshaft as per recommended in the data sheet, following those center lines. This is a different method than I did the first time around, and I'll explain. Yes, all the tools that I'm about to use are the same if you saw that first video. It might be my best work. It's called Cylinder Head 205. It's only a half hour, and in it I make all these tools and I did the job 100% right. So basically what I'm saying is that this time I'm going to do it wrong. Not really wrong, just the lazy way. I'm going to fudge the right answer accurately enough using most of these tools and in a fraction of the time. There's a lot to love about that other video. Caboose even made an appearance. I made that one on Snow Leopard using iMovie 06. It's only 1080 HD and I'll still never be able to improve on that video. I'm just dialing in top dead center here to get everything aligned first, line up my 0 point on the gauge and check it. Also make sure my crank mark is happy, and it is. Next, get the crank bolt out of my way and put this degree wheel on here. If it's a top dead center and you already put the pointer on there, you could have saved yourself a lot of time by just lining up the degree wheel the first time, but this time I have to make a pointer for this 11-inch degree wheel and bolt it on here somewhere else. So I kind of need to do it the other way first, just for the fit.
Wow,
Now wouldn't you know it, in an attempt to upgrade from a copper to a stainless steel pointer, I managed to break the cutters on these needle nose pliers. Should have saw that coming. But anyway, get the degree wheel and the pointer lined up at 0 at top dead center, then go and undo your previous snug fest to remove the valve cover. I know that seems like extra work, but days pass while I edit 6K videos down and it's easy enough so stuff doesn't get lost. And it keeps the dust that already isn't in my clean room out. I'm centering off of the number 1 intake valve retainers, and I just need the gauge to be oriented so that it can travel the full range of movement. This is going to let me see when the valve starts and stops moving so that I can mark the degree wheel. For those who saw the other video, you know I don't have the test lifters and test springs in here right now. And this time I'm doing it with a fully assembled head. There's one problem with doing this with a hydraulic valve train when it's dry, but you can achieve the exact same intended result either way. It's going to cost you some time though. Doing it this way, once you open a valve, you have to wait for all the air in the lifter to bleed back down before taking any further measurements. There's a return spring inside the lifter, so as soon as you close the valve, they take another big gulp of air, and you gotta do it again. So this leaves you waiting a long time. This one took about 5 minutes at maximum lift. It can take even longer, but what it enables you to do once everything's settled down is find the maximum lift point on your camshaft. After all, that's going to be your center line, the middle of the lobe. I can match the manufacturer's installed centerline specification. I just need to know what the cam's current installed centerline is first to do that. Of course, there's going to be some dwell at max lift, meaning there's going to be a degree on that wheel where you achieve max lift and another degree where you lose it. If you can find both of those points, mark them both, and then split the difference. That's your installed centerline, and that's what I'm doing right here. Right there on the degree wheel, in the middle, split that difference. Now count how many degrees are between what you've got on your part and what's on your cam card and cut that in half, because every 1 degree on the cam is 2 degrees on the crank. That should give you a good starting point for your cam gear adjustments. Of course, you can try to check your opening and closing events to confirm your suspicions. There may be good for that, maybe good enough. And I did actually go through that trouble, but without a solid lifter or hydraulic pressure behind it, you really can't trust them. Not with a collapsed lifter in the mix. With this method, you're going to get a good measurement only at max lift while the valve is fully open. This is due to your roller rocker's geometry when that lifter isn't filled up and has oil pressure behind it. The cam lobe is directly over the roller rocker at max lift, whether or not the lifter is inflated. So it's pointed right at it. This method's certainly going to get you within 1 degree of spec. As you just saw, I was 6 degrees off from the 107 centerline spec. I was 6 degrees too early. So my goal here is to retard the camshaft by 3 degrees. There's that halfsies math I was talking about with the cams. My example yielded 3 degrees. Then we check it. That's how we do this one with no test springs. Let's just accelerate all this part. You get it. Yeah, all the painful waiting, marking, remarking, verifying, measuring, all that. I purged all these lifters back when I assembled the head so they're dry, but this one on the intake side had just enough oil in it for me to be able to get a good read on the opening and closing events. Just know that this method isn't always going to work out like this. In places you have to turn the crank backwards to do that. Sometimes you got to wait for it to bleed down. Sometimes you need it inflated, but it can sometimes work. It's unnatural. It's alien to how your timing belt tensioner works, and you still shouldn't trust your opening and closing events like this, but just take your cam card's word for those. Go for your center line here. I got my 107 degree installed spec and my 1 degree before top dead center opening, but came up 2 degrees short on the closing. Check it out. Sorry about the camera angle, but you can see the start and stop of the lobe. It gives me 9 degrees of dwell right there at max lift. 107 is right there in the center of that, so I'm happy. Now let's do the exhaust side. This is a side that I've never been able to get a good read on. When you have the luxury of a cam card, which I didn't in Cylinder Head 205, I had to do it all, you have a whole lot more measuring and math to do. But because I made all the tools that I made in that video and I have this cam card, this is all I have to do to dial them in, match the centerline spec. The intake side was a good first example for this because of the cam lobe's rotational direction. On the exhaust side, the lobe mashes on the lifter side of the roller first with a forward angle. The lobe applies pressure 90 degrees from where the intake side does because it's all on the opposite side, but the cam rotation's the same. They sort of flick forward on the rocker roller instead of mashing down right on the top of it. If you were paying real close attention to the cam card, you'd have seen the power levels that these cams are intended for. Now you know what you have to bring to beat it. I'm not shooting for the moon on this one, but I will turn up the boost and change its diet. You know, show it I care. I didn't have the same leak down results on this side with the dry lifter as I did on the intake side either, you know. But what I did manage to end up was get something that was 16 degrees early for closing there in red for the exhaust valve closing event. Sort of nailed the 113 center line with a 112.7 or whatever, and that's good enough for government work. And the exhaust opening is on a completely different planet, 25 degrees away from where it's supposed to open. That's why you just need to focus on your centerline measurements for this kind of method, not the valve opening and closing events. It took a little bit more on the intake cam adjustment, about 2.8 or 2.9 degrees, it's just short of 3. So my intake events were a little over 5 crankshaft degrees off. That was more than I was expecting to see, but you never really know how many degrees to give it until you check it and make it fit on your setup. Just get your center lines right. The recipe's already built into your block. You just have to season your cams to taste by making them fit. So now that I've been irresponsible and showed you how to cheat, I'm going to seal up this valve cover because we're done in here. Put your coolant system together last because you can break the thermostat housing flipping it like this on some engine stands. The only thing that I need inside of here now is an oil pickup tube, a gasket, 2 bolts, a nut, and an oil pan. Which of course comes with a whole bunch more bolts, but what's rather unsavory about the 6-bolt oil pickup tube is that when you have ARP studs, it doesn't fit. There have been many creative solutions to this over the years, and some are more trouble than they're worth, but because you've been here long enough, you already know that I'm going to use one of those hard methods. I do it all the time. The problem begins when you replace the factory main bolt, that the hole has an M8 stud protruding from the top 4, you know? It fits right on there and you put a nut and a washer on it. Its head is only about a centimeter tall, and that makes mounting the pickup tube really easy because it's engineered to fit specifically that head stud or bolt. In my case, the stud that I'm using is now 2 millimeters larger in diameter, and the stack of nut and washer is at least twice as tall as the factory bolt is, so it's not just a matter of drilling a bigger hole and solving your problem with a lock nut. If you rely solely on that method, then this is what you end up with. A nut that holds on by 2.5 to 3 threads right between your crankshaft counterweights because of the thickness of that flange. I mean, if you feel right about that stuff, truth be told, a tie rod castle nut is a better fit, but you won't be able to get a socket onto it, so have to rely on a whole lot of thread locker for that. And the reason why you can't cut the leg off and trust it is because the connection between the tube and the flange is brazed. So over time, with the weight of the pickup screen assembly vibrating from the engine on the end of it, it can crack that flange. The 2Gs didn't come with this leg on them, but they came right back on the Evos again. They added those, they bolt to the girdle on those cars. It's almost like they figured out something. I guess we'll never know why, but what I'm going to do to deal with those harmonic vibrations on this one is cut the leg off of it. Once I got that thing, I've got to make a brace out of it that I can cut and shape into a piece that will brace the tube near the flange. And I'm going to make something that's more rigid than the tube to transfer all those vibrations right into the flange and bypass it instead of the tube, This way there's no nut to come loose inside my crankcase. The oil tube would be reinforced and my ARP mains remain completely uninvolved with any of its problems. Of course, I can't do this without Matt's help because this requires a skill and safety precautions that I can't seem to even find anywhere lately. But what we're doing here is back purging it to reduce the chance of contaminating the inside of the pickup tube. This prevents oxidizing and it reduces the chance of sugaring the material. This part's just barely galvanized and it's your oil pickup tube, so it's pretty tricky to weld this safely if you don't know how to deal with all that at once. I have to confess, having a friend who's good at this kind of TIG welding stuff will prevent you from learning how or acquiring the equipment. I hated to pull him away from the cool stuff he's been doing, but he totally saved me here, again. Of course, I still ran wire brushes, solvents, and compressed air through it prior to its employment, but this is what I ended up with. I do put thread locker onto the oil pickup bolt holes before I put anything in them because those are not bolts that I ever want to have coming loose. Factory gasket, and there you have it. One gusseted 6-bolt oil pickup tube, unlikely to crack anywhere as easily as if I had just cut off that leg. Not a complicated fix, but definitely not the easiest one of all. You could cut a section out of the leg and tack it back in place, drill the hole bigger, and find a low-profile M10 by 125 lock nut of some sort, I suppose, if you wanted to do that. It would actually be easier than welding on the pickup tube itself. It would take a lot less time and effort. It would eliminate the risk of weakening or degrading the inside of the tube from heat and maybe sucking something up into the engine, but you'd better have an oil pressure gauge if your solution is just to cut it off. I'm making my own timing cover gasket out of Right Stuff Gasket Maker, and even though it says 1 minute, it takes at least 5 hours to set before it's going to work for my intended purpose. But you get to skip all that. In case you missed it, the Gallant block is now a long block. It's complete from valve cover to oil pan, and the GSX block's pretty salty because it just got its crank pulley stolen. I think it's time to scrape off the cam gear stickers that are now very well burnished into the gears by the belt pressure. Everything is torqued, and I've verified that in the video rather than marking all my bolts, but now that I'm done inside the timing cover and I have 5 hours to kill, I might as well bolt on some of these other parts that I got laying around here, like the intake manifold. I'm not using a heat barrier gasket because of the fit of several other factory parts that are going to be attached to it, so I'm just installing the steel factory intake gasket that's also going to survive my EGR configuration. I went through the trouble of bead blasting this bracket. I don't know why I painted it. I should have black oxided and cleared this, but paint's fine. The M8 intake manifold bolts all get 11 to 14 foot-pounds. There's 7 of them, but you'll only ever be able to reach the upper ones with your torque wrench, so do one to calibrate yourself first and get the feel for what the fastener does, and then do all the other ones with a regular old wrench, starting from the center bolt. Save yourself a whole lot of trouble and weird sockets. The M10 nuts and washers on the far ends of the intake manifold get 25 foot-pounds, as well as the M10 bolts that are right next to it. I cleaned up the original coil pack and black oxided its mounting bracket and the bolts, and I think it's wicked. It used to be hideous. Yeah, I've got spare ones that are amazing, but this one came out incredible and it works fine. What didn't used to work so well was the transistor that had a broken connector on it. The transistor worked fine as long as it was plugged in, but you can tell how that would be problematic here. Some worlds are just held together by zip ties. My approach to this repair is pretty obvious, and it's just as dapper as the coil that's sitting right under. I struggled with the bolts for a second, even though they only get 7 to 9 foot-pounds. You don't really need a torque wrench for this. That's actually the cause of half of my struggle. The other half was repeatedly dropping one bolt. I'm sorry for derailing the GSX block's success in this video by having the wrong head gasket. That was totally my fault. Its replacement will be here any moment, so this is only a temporary setback. I didn't imagine that the car that I started last was actually going to be the one that finished first, but here we are. Just little details and parts left to sort out. Like those engine mount bolts that I saved for last. I gave those 85 foot-pounds. And the intake manifold bracket bolts, I gave those 20. You always want to install or torque that intake bracket after you're done with the intake flange. The AC stuff is hanging in the Galant engine bay waiting for its home, and the turbo and the thermostat stuff I'm going to put on later. This clears up a massive amount of space and completes a rigorous inventory of the 6-bolt long blocks assembly. I absolutely could not have produced this result without a whole lot of help, because nobody is everything, but I really enjoyed the process of working with everyone to achieve this example. I hope any of you with a bucket full of old parts can identify them now and fill in all your blanks. And the GSX block doesn't need to worry about this. This isn't a loss. The Galant block isn't the only one that's going to have a fluid damper. It's just the first one. Due to their power goals, they're all going to use it. Yeah, these things aren't cheap, but 1229's been a trooper. It most certainly earned this. There's a whole lot that it contributed to all of us with the cylinder head, the suspension, the interior, and the steering while I rebuilt it. I'm at the stage right now where it's find a hole and plug it with the thing. I finally got a tube of the modern Permatex #1 equivalent. That's what I'll be using from here on out on plugs, sensors, etc. That sensor's 27 mil. Brand new factory oil filter. You see it's wrapped because the oil seal's pre-lubed. Nice. I'm going to wind up oiling my turbo from this spot, but I have the plug for this in the meantime, so I'm going to plug up that hole. Already got the cam angle sensor in there too. Ready to roll. That oil cap is a placeholder. I still need to make up my mind on injectors, install some vacuum hoses, and rebuild a throttle body, but everything else is ready to roll. I'd purchased this Ravenfab coolant pipe for the GSX, but I bought it wrong. I thought I needed the 1G version because of the 6-bolt block, but it's the location of the thermostat housing and not the generation of the block that you'd buy it for. You buy it for which head you're using. I'm using a 7-bolt head on the GSX, so my GSX mistake is the Galant's gain. I installed the air-to-oil filter housing, and this pipe deletes the water-to-oil cooler feed. Even though I have this pipe already for the GSX, modified and powder-coated, I think I'm more likely to order 2 more of these things. This is just incredible. It's hand-welded. And now that's in place, I can go ahead and put the power steering bracket on. That bolts up over top of it right there. Temporarily, of course, I'm still working on 2 pieces over here. Hot side's coming later. I'm going to slap some tape on this and roll it out of here. Make some room in here because I've got some great stuff coming up next. One thing I didn't install yet was the main oil galley plug. I was waiting for that sealant. I taped it to the top of the block so that I'll have it when it's hanging from a chain. It's kind of important. It's the short plug. It's a very specific plug. Not everyone selling them will send you a short plug, but they're forgiven. I have them all. But looky here, Jafro just built an engine again, and she's a looker. This engine's dialed in. It's ready to install. And at 8.5 to 1, 0-day refreshed, it's going to have all the compression, all the ignition, and it will withstand far more than anything I ever plan to throw at it. So in summary, this is just one out of 3 engine builds currently going on right now. We still have a whole lot to do on the GSX block because the head isn't even assembled yet. I have a gift from a Patreon that I can't wait to share with all of you. I also have a mess to clean up here from this one first, but the GSX's 7-volt is also going to come out of its wraps. No, I'm not installing them both in the car at the same time, but wouldn't that be cool? We just made room for it. We're still going to go too wide through the assemblies. You'll be able to see differences of the 6 and 7 bolts side by side. They're somehow going to be intergenerational twins, and I know that sounds really gross, but we're talking about engines here. It's not. Come back and check it out. Thank you, Tubes. Thank you, Patreon. Put this in your favorites in case you ever have to touch a 6-bolt 4G63. Hit the things, and don't forget to tell me what you think in the comments. And until next time, stay tubed!